Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi, to the Genshin Impact 6.2 banner review. I am not calling it Luna 3. I don't care. It's 6.2. Anyway, Durin is coming out, Jahoda is coming out, and Venti is getting a rerun. So we've got some interesting things to talk about, because we also have all of the witch buffs to take into account, and one of the characters that is getting buffed is Venti himself. So we've got a lot to yap about, so let's just get started already. We start with Durin. And honestly, I feel like I've talked about Durin so much already, and I did a fairly long pre-release video, that I don't have that much to add to that. Overall, Durin's a pretty solid character to get. He's a very versatile character that'll be one of the, if not the best teammate for honestly a very large portion of the carries we have, and who can also be played as a carry himself. That being said, as I mentioned towards the end of the second part of my pre-release, he's not actually a major upgrade for that many characters. If the team DPS increase from getting Durin is like 3%, it doesn't really matter. At that point, if you're gonna get a new 5-star, go for a 5-star that is more than 3%, or maybe even just a constellation that's gonna do a lot more for you. The characters that Durin is actually a noticeable increase for as a support, so for people that aren't particularly interested in using Durin as a carry, are, from what I've looked at, Chaska, Kinich, and maybe Linny. With Linny, it's not so much a team DPS upgrade, it's a lot more just not having to deal with the Bennett buff in the good teams anymore. Because Bennett is really good for Linny, but he feels really bad to play because of the uptime issues and the circle impact stuff. Outside of those three carries, though, I don't think there's too many carries where you really want to get Durin, where he's like an important part of your team building. And as good as Durin is as a whole, with the way the power creep has gone recently, unless you are already like decided on a specific team where you know you will be using Durin and you know that using him will be a noticeable increase, from a purely meta perspective, getting him might not do that much for you. He doesn't really enable any sort of like new interaction or playstyle that doesn't already exist. So if content is designed around incentivizing a character like him, you'll generally have other alternatives available that may not be as good in the teams where you can use Durin, but that might be able to get through. I want to clarify, I'm saying a lot of negative things here. That's mainly because Durin is a good unit. So I think it's more important for good units to be properly aware of their limitations, because not everyone's account is the same. People are going to receive different value from getting new characters based on the whole landscape of their account. And if the only thing you hear about is, hey, Durin is a good character, without too much emphasis being put on his limitations, you might feel like he's more important to get than he actually is. But just because I'm insisting on his downsides, his limitations, doesn't mean he's a bad character. And I don't want people to take that away either. So I want to clarify that. Honestly, overall, Durin is going to be a pretty good character. And I can definitely see him staying prevalent in the meta. The witch buffs requiring 2 witches also kind of opens up some really annoying possibilities for the future, where if we get a character later on that doesn't have good synergy with any of the other witches except Durin, you might not be able to use the alternatives to Durin that exist that fulfill a similar function in general. But honestly, if a character is dependent on him later on, you can just get Durin on a rerun. That's pretty much it for Durin. If you want to know more, you can just go watch the pre-release videos. Next up is Venti. And I also recorded a video on Venti because I recorded the video on all of the characters that are receiving buffs next patch. But I recorded it pretty early into the beta cycle for Venti, so my thoughts have progressed a little bit since then. Back at the very start of the game, Venti was very good because content was designed in a way that made grouping a really, really useful mechanic. But as the game progressed, they kind of stopped giving us enemies against which grouping was good. And it was only with the release of Inazuma in 2.0 that we started getting bosses in Abyss. And nowadays, we have bosses in literally every Abyss. Bosses are actually more common than non-bosses nowadays. And so the utility of grouping has moved from being really good at doing Abyss, which was the endgame content back then, to not even being very good in Abyss. And then lately with the release of Siege and Onslaught, which is exclusively bosses, being even worse. There are a lot of people that don't realize how good Venti was back in 1.0. And it wasn't because our understanding of the game was worse back then. It wasn't that people were wrong about Venti being good back then. It's that the game as a whole just straight up changed. In terms of his value as a grouper, this is still the case. However, the buffs obviously have given him some value outside of being a grouper. He can now be used as a carry, and he's similar in power to the other animal carries we have. Not that they're all that good, so it doesn't mean that you necessarily want to use them as a carry. Next patch has a Stygian Onslaught boss that heavily favors grouping and animo, so Venti will be good for that boss, but that's one patch and it's probably not going to be the case after that, so keep that in mind. But honestly, it's not just about that. One of the really annoying things about Venti is that his bursts auto-targeting forces the burst to spawn relatively far from his position, which forces you against enemies that don't move or that aren't groupable to dash backwards before you burst so that the burst is on the enemies. On top of that, if you miss it by a little bit, it's possible that the burst doesn't get the absorption. Now, his burst will auto-target where it's not just going to be in the direction of the closest enemy, the center of the black hole will be on the enemy's hitbox, which means it will be a lot easier to make sure you get the absorption, and it'll allow you to not need to go backwards, which can increase the amount of time it takes, which also makes it hard to get a Bennett buff snapshot on his burst, for example. Venti's absorption isn't that good, but it's also not that bad. Setting aside the damage that it deals, it can also restore energy to characters of the element that was absorbed because of the Storm Eye passive, which means that being able to get this reliably can be good for mono teams. The biggest problem is that right now mono teams kind of suck ass, and the ones that are good don't really need energy, right? When you're looking at the sort of characters that see play in mono teams, you have like Arlecchino, for example, who doesn't use her burst. And so the value of this doesn't tend to be too high. After the patch, you'll have Klee as well, but Klee's passive generates a lot of energy, so you don't really need this either. It also prioritizes Hydro over Electro. So in Flynn's teams, for example, you'll absorb a Hydro, so you can't use them as a Flynn's battery. All in all, a lot of Venti's strengths either have disappeared from the game or can't really be capitalized on with the current cast. So I think Venti is a sort of character where his buffs were a pretty big deal, right? They made him a lot better, but I don't think he's better enough to really be worth recommending at this point. I definitely think he could see some play if we get better animal carries released in the future, because with the new buffs, he now gives 50% damage to characters that trigger Swirl. So animal characters will be able to get 50 damage percent if they use Venti on their team. But honestly, I still don't think Venti is necessarily a good character to get, especially for newer players. If you try to play Venti as a carry, your damage will straight up be like maybe a little bit over half of what a Mawika carry team can do with a premium Venti team. If you like him though, you can definitely make him work, and specifically next patch, you know, the Abyss is gonna have 41 enemies on the first chamber. It's meant to sell Venti. The Stygian Onslaught has a boss where one of its mechanics spawns groupable tornadoes, and if you group the tornadoes, his resistance to Animo gets shredded by like 100% or something. So like they're really trying to sell Venti with that. So at the very least, next patch, if you really like Venti, you'll be able to use him as a carry. For people who already have Venti and are thinking about getting his cons, they did buff his cons, and if you really want to play him as a carry, you kind of can, but as we're gonna see later, he's also getting a new signature weapon, and I think between cons and Sig, I'd probably lean a little bit more towards Sig. Next, we can talk about the 4 stars. So, Jahoda. How good is Jahoda? She's okay. She's got one of those C6s for 4-star characters that make her kind of a different unit altogether if you have the C6 versus if you don't. If you don't have the C6, Jahoda is like a whatever kind of shitty Sucrose side grade that has some healing but is a little bit worse than Sucrose. In a lot of Sucrose's teams, it works. She's like okay. And if you do have her C6, she's a conditional upgrade in some of the Nodcry teams. It's not as important as, say, Faruzan's C6 or Chevaliers C6, because honestly, she's just not as good as a whole for the teams as those two characters are. But she's pretty nice to have. She helps open up team building options, lets you use Sucrose on your other team, especially if you want to play Molani with the upcoming changes next patch. Molani's best team, you're gonna really want to have Sucrose. So getting Jahoda for your Flynn's team, for example, can be nice. But pulling for Jahoda on a banner like this isn't something I'd necessarily recommend. The fact that we are getting our second 4-star Nodcry character means that even for some people who don't have any of the Nodcry 5-star, they'll be able to get Ascendant Gleam for content that straight up like strictly requires you to have it. But the teams that use Jahoda plus Ino are honestly pretty bad, so I'm not too optimistic about that. Anyways, next up we have Faruzan. As a whole, Faruzan is a character who's very reliant on her C6 to be good, and who is pretty far ahead of the competition in Animo teams. But the main reason why she's so far ahead of the competition is because the overall amount she provides is good, but also Animo characters don't have access to that many options for shred. And guess which character on this banner can shred Animo? That's right, Durin. So Durin's release is actually going to make Faruzan a lot less important to Animo teams. Non-C6 Faruzan is very often going to be outright worse than Durin for Animo teams. And there's quite a few teams where she's just getting knocked out of the team completely because of Durin. That doesn't mean she's like actually gone. She's still quite good to have on teams, especially if you do have the C6. But the gap between the Faruzan teams and the non-Faruzan teams for Animo carries that aren't just doing some wheelchair bullshit is going to be a lot smaller next patch. But like, if you're someone who cares about an Animo carry and cares about getting Faruzan constellations, like if you end up getting Durin, the Faruzan constellations are gonna matter a lot less because Faruzan as a whole will matter a lot less. If you like Durin, you're pretty happy to see this, right? But if you don't like Durin and you're an Animo player, you see this banner and you know for a fact Faruzan isn't gonna be on banner again for a while. That means that the next rerun of your Animo carry is likely not gonna have Faruzan as one of the 4-stars on banner. And that might be upsetting. To me, this kind of hints at Varka's best team likely using Durin and not being that reliant on Faruzan. So I don't really know how to feel about all of that. As a whole, Faruzan is a good character, right? The amount she provides is pretty good, but because she only buffs Animo damage, and Durin is a pretty good character that shreds Animo, so has some role overlap with Faruzan, and does damage to himself that is reasonable enough to like matter, and that is not Animo. That's like a 2-hit combo of making Faruzan less important, because you now have a larger portion of your team DPS that isn't Animo, and you now already have shred. So Faruzan is buffing a lower portion of your team DPS by a lower amount. Still enough to be good, but a lot less important. And finally, Bennett, the GOAT. Bennett is really good. Bennett C0 is really good. Bennett C1 is quite nice. Bennett C5 is quite nice. And Bennett C6 is quite nice. Nowadays, I mean, yeah, if you see someone telling you Bennett is not very good, you know they're rage baiting. I think people tend to overestimate his C1 a little bit. The part that matters of his C1 isn't really the fact that it becomes unconditional, right? Because at C0, Bennett only gives attack buff when he's not healing. But Bennett heals so much that the amount of time he spends not healing tends to be really small. So even at C0, you have pretty good uptime on the attack buff. The part that matters about the C1 is more so just the plus 20%. Unless you're playing Arlecchino. If you're playing Arlecchino, she can't heal. So once she drops below 70% at C0, Bennett doesn't buff her anymore. So for Arlecchino players specifically, that part of the C1 matters, but that's kind of it. But yeah, Bennett C1 is good. Bennett C5 is basically another 20-ish%. His other constellations don't really exist, right? The C2 gives ER, but it's not that much. The C4 gives him the ability to do a 3-hit E with hold level 1 instead of hold level 2, but you don't really use it even for carry Bennett. So realistically, his relevant constellations are C1, C5, and C6. C6 gives the Pyro Infusion, and there's a lot of people that don't want to activate Bennett C6, and there are a few characters that actually get worse if you do. But they have definitely gone out of their way to make it so that most characters that would suffer from Bennett C6 have an infusion that cannot be overridden. Not all of them, though. Chiori, for example, is a character who at C6 is played as a carry, and her best team includes Bennett, and C6 Bennett makes your team worse. So if you don't want to activate Bennett C6 because you're worried that a character you'll really like in the future will want Bennett, and they're not going to be designed to work with as a C6, I can understand that, but there's really not a lot of them, and most of them are characters where their stuff is only available through constellations. And honestly, I haven't actually done calcs on C6 Chiori lately, so maybe Bennett isn't even in those teams anymore, because Durin is also going to be good there. So anyways, I think as a whole, Bennett C6 is a pretty good thing to activate nowadays. It's really good for Razor if you're playing Razor carry. It's really good for Durin if you're playing Durin carry. So the fact that he is on the Durin banner is pretty impactful. I think if you like Durin, all three of those characters can actually be played in Durin teams. So you can play Jahoda in teams with Durin, with like Durin Inefa. You can play Faruzan with animal carries for Durin, and you can play Bennett in a lot of Durin's teams in general. With Venti, Faruzan is also pretty good. Bennett is pretty good. Jahoda is like fine. But the reason why I think these banners are a little bit diabolical isn't because the banners themselves, it's because what the banners indicate about the future, especially for people that want animal carries but don't want either of these two characters. I think it's really unfortunate that Faruzan is on this one. Do not go for a 4-star character hoping not to get the 5-star. Building pity is not a thing you should ever do on banners where you would be unhappy to get the 5-star character. And finally, let's talk about the weapon banner. So, 2 new 5-star weapons. First off is the new Venti bow. A lot of yapping here. The Daybreak Chronicles. It's a high base attack bow with crit damage, and the effect looks a lot more complicated than it is. But basically, you start combat with 60 damage % to normal skill and burst, and that damage goes down over time when you're not using those abilities. So if you're using those abilities and they hit often, like Venti's Burst, Oz, stuff like that, you can maintain the 60%. Otherwise, it'll go down, and it can go down to 0 if you don't have things that hit often at all. If you have the Witch Resonance active, instead of counting the stacks individually, it counts the stacks together, and they're 20% per hit instead of 10. So basically, for example, right, on Venti, if you don't have Witch Resonance activated, because your combat starts before your uptime starts, when you swap to Venti, you'll use his burst. The first 5 hits of his burst will not have the full 60. They'll start at 0. I'm pretty sure this doesn't snapshot, so it builds up to 60. Then same for the normal attacks. The first few normal attacks don't have this buff. And then the skills, because the skill has a cooldown, the skill will consistently have 0 stacks. If you do have Witch Resonance, your first 2 hits stack it up. Like, your first 3 hits stack it up instantly for all of your attack types. So basically, this is kind of a cringe weapon if you don't have Witch Resonance, but if you do, it's just 60 damage % to normal, skill, and burst damage. Do take notice, this is not to charge attacks, so a lot of the bow users that are carries won't be able to use this well. Right, Chaska, Ganyu, Yoimiya on the other hand. Poor Thundering Pulse, I guess. All in all, for Venti, this is a pretty good weapon. The biggest issue that Venti has is that his 4-star options are, like, awful, actually. When you play Venti as a carry, his damage is split basically 50-50 between normal attack damage and burst plus skill damage. So Stringless only affects half of his damage, but Rust too. So neither of them is all that good, and both of them are going to feel bad to use. And because of that, this weapon is a pretty big upgrade on him, but also it's still Venti carry, so it's still not that great of a team. If you're wondering, like, okay, I already have Venti because I got him back in 1.0, and I would be willing, because, like, the way I see it is just I already have this Venti, I would be willing to go for a signature weapon as the equivalent of pulling for a new character for Venti carry. If you're looking at it that way, Venti carry is like an okay character, but it's not going to be quite as good as, you know, Durin carry and stuff like that. Next up, we have Durin's signature weapon. It's a medium base attack, 608 with crit rate substat. Crit damage from burst is increased by 16%. When burst hits, attack is increased by 20%, and nearby characters get their attack increased by 16%. The attack increase buffs are increased to 35% to self and 28% to team if you have Witch Resonance. Honestly, this is kind of a weird weapon because there's some teams where this is a really good weapon for Durin, and there's some teams where this is straight up not even his best weapon. So it's hard to give like an overall rating of it. As a support weapon, it's pretty good. As a carry weapon, it's not. That being said, one thing I will say is, like, if you are a Venti main or whatever and you want to play Venti carry, Durin is going to be part of Venti carry's best team, and both of these weapons will be good for the team. So specifically for the 3 Venti mains out there, this weapon banner is really good. Anyways, before we like pass judgment on the banner as a whole, let's quickly talk about the 4-star weapons. So Stringless, not that much to say about it as a whole. Good weapon on Fischl. Fischl's getting a buff. Very nice. You're happy to see a Stringless if you don't have Stringless R5. You're not happy to see it if you do. Ali Flash has a higher base attack than the craftables, so it tends to be a good weapon on Bennett for people who don't have Aquila or Skyward, but it's not really that big of a deal. For Spectre's Drill kind of needs refines to be good, and it's not really that good on anyone anyways. It's okay. You can use it. It's fine, whatever. Rain Slasher is a weapon that is sometimes usable in really funny ways. It's sometimes good on Mawika, sometimes good on like Diluc and whatever. But with a lot of the pyro carries moving away from Vape and into Melt teams, and with the introduction of lunar reactions that don't care about damage percent for electro carries, Rain Slasher just isn't that good. And finally, we have White and Song, which is a weapon that a lot of people I think have forgotten exists for good reason, right? High base attack, ER substat. Hitting an opponent with a normal attack decreases the stamina consumption of sprint by 14%. 22 at R5. Additionally, using a sprint or alternate sprint increases attack by 40%. Honestly, 40% attack and 30% ER on a high base attack weapon, it's not even that bad. But the thing is, most characters that care about these stats either want the buff for more than 5 seconds or don't want to dash. This is like supposed to be a Mona weapon. That's why it specifically says alternate sprint, but it's not even good on Mona because Mona doesn't want to dash ever. Wine and Song is really bad. Overall, the 4-star lineup here is like whatever. It's not outstanding. It could be worse, right? Stringless and Ali Flash are definitely the highlights here, but it's definitely below average. And then the 5-star lineup, it is heavily dependent on what you want to play. If you're intending to play Venti carry with Durin on the team, this is like the best 5-star lineup you could hope for. Like straight up the best 2 weapons in the game for you. If you're intending on playing carry Durin and you want to get a weapon for him, his Sig is sometimes worse than other 5-star weapons. His Sig only tends to really be better in teams where you don't on-field Durin, and as you might be aware of already if you've watched the pre-release video, I feel like they kind of fucked up the balance of Durin's normal and charge attacks, and they made him a little bit too strong, which makes it so that Durin's best carry teams are actually his on-field ones. In those teams, his signature weapon is a lot worse. Multiple reasons, right? One, because just the amount of stats that are provided aren't as high, and also a part of the signature only buffs the burst, not normal and charge attack. But 2, because one of the upsides of on-fielding him is that you get to use Farina to give him a better set bonus with Maréchaussée. And with Maréchaussée plus this, you end up with a lot of crit rate, and it makes it harder not to overcap. That might be a bit less impactful later on if we actually get a witch set, so that's cool. But yeah, I would say if you're a Venti main that is going to get Durin, this is a great banner. If you're planning on getting this because you want to main Durin, this is a really bad banner. And if you're planning on going for Durin as support for one of your teams, if you're playing Tosca, Kinich, whatever, or even if you're playing a character where Durin isn't as big of a deal, but is still good, right? Characters like Valheim, characters like Barissa, his signature weapon is, like, that's where his signature weapon tends to be most impactful. And the Venti bow as a stat stick can be quite good on Fischl, so that's kind of cool. Overall, I'd say that the 5-star lineup is better than average in general, but there's going to be a few situations where based on what you have, it might be completely worthless. And the 4-star lineup is below average. Overall, pretty okay banner. Character banners, honestly, I'd say the Durin banner is above average. The Venti banner, maybe not so much. I think that's going to do it for the banner review. Honestly, I'm really excited for all the witch buffs. Venti being given a carry playstyle is kind of nice for people who main Venti, but honestly, it doesn't seem that interesting. I'm a lot more excited for the other ones. I'm excited about Razor. I'm excited about Mona. Like, those are the main 2 right now. But yeah, so I'm looking forward to that. I can't wait to try them out. As usual, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.